Hello, welcome to this episode of my Clarendon Chronicles podcast. My guest today is a returning guest, Dr. Darren Stevens, who is a developmental psychologist and next level coach. The importance of that will become very relevant in the course of the next few moments. Darren, amongst many roles, is the founder of the Institute for Adult Development, a lecturer at Northampton University in the UK, and the creator constructed development theory and coaching. We're going to recap on that as well. His academic qualifications include a BA Honours Degree in Business Management, a BSc Degree in Psychology, an MSc in Behavioural Sciences, and a PhD in Cognitive Behavioural Psychology. Dr. Stevens has coached leaders and teams in multinational companies, and his powerful approach strengthens leaders and organisational capabilities through transformational cognitive development and higher level systemic thinking. Darren presents new ways for executives, managers, and consultants to reflect on who they are as leaders, how they relate to and impact others, and how to challenge their organization to reach new levels of excellence. Darren joined me just a few months ago on a first edition on my podcast, and I instantly invited Darren back to talk about further coaching developments, and in particular, as I mentioned before, next level coaching. But first, Darren, you're returning to my podcast. In the previous podcast, we spoke about constructed development theory. Can we just recap on what that means to us as coaches and also as coachees, Darren?
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. Basically, it's the foundation for how we think. And what I say in my original thesis is it's the conduit, it's the bridge between domain-specific thinking, like organizations, coaching, whatever, and domain general thinking, like how we are. You know, there's a phrase that says how you do everything is how you do anything, or the other way around. How you do anything is how you do everything. It's not entirely true. And my theory says that when you're in the pub playing golf or squash or just having fun with your family, are you a different Jeremy or a different Darren? And we know we wear different hats, but that's not the point. The point is, do you know how to construct yourself in the moment differently to match that environment? And I use intention, awareness, choice, and response, the 4 pillars of CDT. What's your intention in the moment? How aware are you of that intention? What choices does that awareness create? And can you then choose your response based on what your choices are? So intention, awareness, choice, response. It's key to know that we do construct ourselves, and it's our level of self-awareness in that moment that determines our cognitive and social emotional complexity. So the reason it's useful is because it does transcend arenas, and it really does impact coaching a lot. So we're talking about that today, next level coaching and how. But for me, constructive development theory is really about how aware are you right now in the moment of how you're being, thinking, doing, behaving, whatever, that kind of thing.
That's a really good summary. And you mentioned a couple of things there. I'd just like to pick up on there, because you mentioned those 4 pillars, which we'll come on to. You also mentioned, and I mentioned in the introduction as well, around you're the founder of the Institute for Adult Development. And you talked about coaching in particular. And for those people watching this, can anybody be a coach, in your opinion, Darren?
Now, that's a leading question. No, they can't. And I've had lots of experience with this, and they're in my book, which I'm sure we'll touch on. The point is, right, if using my awareness quotient scale, using Robert Kegan's levels of adult development, Otto Lasky's levels of development scale is constructed, right? If someone is thinking at this level with their cognitive and social emotional complexity, and someone is this level, which might not be quite as high, this person cannot coach this person. It sounds controversial. It's not really. It's fairly obvious, right? You know people who you think they couldn't coach me. But what we've got now is a language around it and a few labels that are, they're useful. Labels are useful. They're not always true, but they are useful. And what this means is this person here cannot, using constructive development theory, we have 50 shortcuts that we use in our ways of constructing our thinking
So
style.
just let me pause there, because let me
Sorry.
unpick that, because that was really something, and I've got your documentation in front of me, and that jumped off the page in that you quote that there are, as you just say there, 50 shortcuts in our thinking that we use, typically out of awareness, to construct our unique thinking style. What does that actually mean to me? 50 ways, is that 50 things buzzing around our heads, and are we making those choices consciously or unconsciously?
Well, unconscious. So as you said, I teach at Northampton, and I was teaching some police apprentices on Monday, and we used just two of them. And I separated the room into people who are individualist, which is one shortcut, and team player, which is another shortcut. And I'm guessing that everybody listening will know that people who are individualists want to work on their own, and people who are team players prefer to be around other people, right?
Yeah, so we
And
can
what I did was,
recognize that. Yeah, yeah.
yes, sir, we can do that. And what I got them to do is I got them to design their favorite, most useful office space, right? And individualists always create the same space. Team players always create the same space, different to each other. And all it demonstrates is that out of the 50 cognitive shortcuts, just two of them impact how we think and behave in a work environment. But individualists, by the way, want boxes and our own little spaces and cubicles, whereas team players generally want your Google Office and your Amazon Office with beanbags and things, right? And social
That's
spaces.
just one example that you've described there, which fundamentally can potentially destroy an organizational environment
Yeah.
by the 50% of people who go for option one and the 50% of people who go for option two. We've already got that conflict immediately
Well,
through
and in the
something
feedback,
which, yeah.
and in the feedback in the moment, the people who were the people who were team player were saying, "Oh my, that's rubbish. We can't do that. That's terrible." To the people who are individualists. But the thing is, right? Think about it this way: if you've got a boss who comes in and you've got a room full of team players, and your boss is an individualist, and he says, "I don't like this. I'm going to start putting cubicles everywhere." Just
Oh,
two
yeah.
cognitive shortcuts. And then you combine that with internal, external, own, awareness, all the other 48. You've got a phenomenal potential combination of 50 by 50 cognitive shortcuts, which is a phenomenal number of especially when you then combine, well, 50 by 50 is £2.5 grand, but
Yeah.
it's 2.5 million. But so when you look at the potential combinations at 5% increments, so internal at 100 and external at 0, 5% increments, and then please forgive me, 95, 5%, 90. You've got like almost an infinite number of potential profiles that come out of what is the identity compass, which makes it so much more robust than your MBTIs and your psychometrics, because I can tell you specifically how you construct you in the moment and whether it's a choice or not, which is the awareness quotient scale. So from a coaching perspective, imagine trying to coach someone who was levels above you in their capacity to choose who and how they are in the moment. I couldn't coach somebody who's at AQ9. I haven't met anybody at AQ9, but that's not the point. I couldn't coach them because I'm about 8.4 at best, and I suspect I fluctuate. But that also means that when you look at the big players like your EMCCs and your ICFs, even the BPS, they give a process for coaching. And I'm saying that I don't do procedures, for example, procedures or options. I'm an options person. It's a pain in the bum, which means that if you give me a process for coaching, I'm going to bail on that process almost immediately because I don't do procedures. And I might be exactly what you said. I might not be aware that I have that pattern. But if you did the identity compass profile, I would show you your patterns and what they specifically mean for your thinking and behaving. And I profiled one lady once who, in her organization, very clever lady, very clever lady. She's my age, so 28, and she got a PhD. She got a first at Cambridge, like 94. Back when it was really difficult. I'm kidding. And she then went into an organization, and she was getting glass ceilinged. It's not a verb. She was getting glass ceilinged all the time, and she thought it was because she was a woman. When I explained to her that her thinking was 8.4, phenomenally high level woman, it's because the men around her didn't understand the things she said and couldn't see her patterns. She needed someone not to coach her, not even to mentor her, but she needed a developmental dialogue. And there was no one around her capable of doing that because no one could see her level of thinking. Everybody else was down here.
So in an organization, and we will have in the audience today, we will have people directors, we'll have CFOs, we'll have CEOs, entrepreneurs, and already we've heard just one example of that conflict. So with how do we normally get round that? So to take that actual example, the individualist versus the team player, and I'm thinking in other circumstances as well. And I'm a big fan of sport, and I love the comparisons between sport and business. How does a manager or a leader in sport and a leader in an organization, how do they address that conflict straight away? Because they're not, let's take a working assumption that they won't have read your documentation. So
Probably true.
how do they deal with it? How do they come up with a solution to that?
Well, think about football. The manager is on the sidelines, but the leader is on the pitch, right? Well, who was that fellow the other day? Declan Rice. Was he leading when he kicked those 2 goals? And please forgive me, I know nothing about football. However, I do keep up with the news, and I saw the goals and how phenomenal were they? He instantly became their leader, right? He went from you've got a team sport, everybody works together, and they know instinctively who to pass to, when, and how, right? But are they really leading? So what we do is we get them to do the opposite. In essence, if we got somebody who was a really good team player and not very good at being an individual, at some point this will limit their thinking, right? So depending on how old they are, me at over 50, it's going to take me a couple of months to change, right? Because you're literally changing the synaptic pathways in your brain. I would need to do the opposite pattern for a good couple of months, not because I then can only do that, but then it brings it to choice. So I can then, my brain will automatically pick the path of least resistance, and that will be this normal pattern, say, for example, team player. So I need to do individualist for a couple of months to get to the point where the brain has a choice of going down 2 pathways. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So is the knack then, and that's a very academic phrase, is the knack then as a CEO or a chair or a leader or a team manager in an organizational setting, is the real knack to identify the people who are in those various compartments and recognize that first? So at least we have a starting point, as opposed to, for example, assuming that everyone's individuals or everyone's a team player. Is the challenge first to step back, be the person on the sidelines, and assess what's in front of you in either using
Yeah.
your theory or using their own, I suppose,
Yeah.
common sense would be that approach.
It sounds like common sense, but I can give you an example of me where I'm not very good. I was running a program at my university for apprenticeships, and the apprenticeship program is externally validated. Now, the people side of things, as you can imagine, I'm pretty good at the people side of things, and the apprentices and students love me, and I'm funny and blah, blah, very tall and handsome, as you can see. However, the apprenticeship being externally validated requires certain auditable conditions. And my brain can't be audited, Jeremy. So I am not the best person to run the program. And I figured this out. We all figured it out before I got into too much trouble, and I passed it on to somebody who'd be better at it. So it's not just about understanding who's in the room. You don't give them things based on these cognitive shortcuts. You don't give them things that they can't do. And I have no problem. It's not even humility. It's just, that's not how my brain works. You know, I can't. Oh, Darren, you had a meeting with Jeremy in 2004. Can you show me the Word document that accompanied that meeting? No, of course not. You know, because I didn't even think about it. And then when you're asked by your bosses, well, why didn't you do this as well? I said, it doesn't even enter my head to do that. That's not how my brain works. And understanding how your brain works is so key in a work environment. Your boss, if your boss is any good in paying attention, they'll give you the jobs that you're good at. And then somebody will say, well, what about the jobs you're not good at, to stretch you? It depends.
And that's the real skill, isn't it? As a leader, by first identifying. I'll give you an example. My own background as a CFO, I was far more interested in tomorrow and what you could do with situations, whether it be M&A and business combinations. I was more interested in that than what I knew had to be done, such as a very strong controls, procedures environment to protect the organization, to protect it from risk, and to protect the assets of the organization.
Mm.
But I did spot that there were other people who were really, really good at that, maybe not quite as good at some of the other things that I was half decent at. And that kind of comes back to my own theory, which is to be that leader, you don't have to be the subject matter expert, but what you do have to be is the people, the one of the best people to understand your people. And if I look at, again, going back to sport, I look at cricket's my sport, for example, and I'm going back a long time, further than you, Darren. But for those people who follow cricket, there was a gentleman who captained England in the 70s and the early 80s called Mike Brearley, who I believe was a psychologist, very commonly regarded as not one of the better players at all, but one of the most successful captains in that era to get the most out of his, what at that time was a very extreme range of characters in the England team. So that's what we're talking about, isn't it, Darren? We're talking about the leader of that team who isn't necessarily the best player in the team, but can get the absolute maximum out of the other 10.
Absolutely. And for me, from a martial arts perspective, having done that for 30 years, you can have a martial artist who's a phenomenal martial artist, but a terrible fighter. You can have a guy who's a phenomenal fighter, but lacks a little bit of finesse.
And this is all part of your theory. This is all part of your constructed development theory. This is all part of your next. So how do you coach that? So I invited you again today to talk more about next level coaching. Yeah. So what's next level coaching then? Is that, can anybody do that? Can we train ourselves to do that? How would you describe that to a layman, Darren?
It's basically based on what I said earlier about levels of development. If you have to go through, you at least have to do an identity compass profile to figure out what your own developmental level is and where your weaknesses are. And I'll explain where your superpower lies after in a second based on that. But the reason I created the Institute for Adult Development is because I couldn't get things like the ICF to validate what my approach. And my approach is this: at the different levels of thinking, you can or cannot coach someone. It's that simple. Even the process wouldn't be useful if you can't see their patterns, if you can't understand what they're doing. And think about individualist and team player, what we said earlier. If somebody is individualist and someone else is team player, right, there's this massive gap between those two scores. The person who can coach them is the person who can see both sides. If that's you, you can't coach them. If that's you, you can't coach them. If that's you, you can coach them. And it's that simple. And I've oversimplified it for obvious reasons.
Can you be both? Can a really skilled coach take your theory and coach here and coach here? Or are they not able to do that?
If they are balanced on those two cognitive intentions, yes. If they're not balanced, and I've seen this 100 times, I'm not making this up to support my own theory. If they're like this on any combination of cognitive intentions in the pairs, they cannot see this gap. This gap is the superpower of the coach. And what we call it in the IAD is a more complex other. Now that name might change. I don't know. But at the moment, more MCO, right? This is their superpower. They can see one or two or three cognitive intentions, balances that you can't see. And I have this. People come to me, colleagues and friends who are working with me, say, Darren, you do this, because it's also my blind spot. I don't do procedures very well. Well, you've just heard why I no longer run the apprenticeship program. So it's that. Go on, Jeremy. I can see.
And I'm thinking, what other pairings, what other conflicts would we recognize as leaders in an organization? So the individualist and team coaching is something we can instantly recognize. what are some of the others that we can go away and think, do you know what, I've got 20 people working with me as colleagues. What are the other things that perhaps are more common that we
Yeah,
can see or hear that we can begin to start thinking about in addressing?
a couple of things, right? Towards, away from. I think we pretty much, a few of us will know this. Towards, away from, it's basically we're looking at your level of risk.
Mm,
Somebody who is massively away from is risk averse. Somebody who is
mm,
massively towards is a bit gung ho. They don't even see
yep,
the risks, right? You need someone in your team who is massively goal oriented, and you need someone in your team who's massively risk averse, because
yep,
the rest of them will keep them all in check. However, the person who's risk averse will be getting them to check everything. Don't do that. You don't know what's going to happen. Don't do. You see what I mean? So risk aversion, goal orientation,
yeah,
and risk awareness.
great comparison. Yeah, and I think we can all recognise that, and I've worked with people like that as well. In that
You're a
the
CFO, so
yeah.
in essence, I would say, forgive me if I'm wrong, but I would say you're a bit more risk averse.
Yeah, I think the challenge for a good CFO, Darren, as well, is one where there is that perception of
Yes.
this person is going to be risk averse. And I think one of the challenges improving and again, for those people watching who aspire to be a good CFO, my coaching advice would be you've got to learn to put yourself in the head of the risk hungry person. Even if you're not necessarily going to agree with it, but at least act as the anchor or the person who's not necessarily slowing them down, at least understand what's going through somebody else's mind. And I guess these are the people who always see the big account coming in. We buy the big machine because I'm going to be able to fill it straight away. Whereas the CFO, I think, has to be somebody who it edges towards the risk averse, but has to be able to balance it, because if you didn't take any risks, we wouldn't do anything. And therefore, we wouldn't create any jobs, we wouldn't create any investment. So, yeah, great comparison. Any others that we can instantly see, Darren?
Global in details would be a good one as well. I mean, I've got 50, they're all
Mm,
next to me on the thing here. Global in
mm,
details. So people who focus on if you're a project manager, my wife is a program director, whatever that means. So she runs projects, or people running projects, but she was also a banker, and she's phenomenally risk averse. To be honest with you, Jeremy,
mm,
if she'd listened to me, we'd be millionaires by now. But
mm,
she's so risk averse. But she does details well. I can walk into this living room looking for my glasses and can't see them, and they're on the sofa, right? But I'm a global thing. I'm a big picture thinker.
mm,
How do I get down to details? If I were a project manager, I'd want people who are detail oriented around me, and procedural, so that they can follow the procedures and focus on the details.
yeah.
Now, I teach this at my university about project management, and these cognitive shortcuts come up all the time, because once you get around the fact that project management is about procedures and details, we then
Mm.
start talking about human beings,
Yeah.
and that's the
And we've
fun
got
part.
and we've got 50 cognitive intentions here that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis in our organizations without necessarily knowing that we're dealing with it. So
Yeah.
the capacity for failure, I suppose, or lack of success, let's call it that, lack of success, that capacity is huge. And it's unsurprising, therefore, that we have conflict in an organization then.
Yeah. We have a bit. I mean, as human beings with these 50 shortcuts, we have habituated patterns, and
Yeah.
we know people who act and react emotionally or angrily or whatever without thinking. It's just their default reaction, because they've built up
Mm,
a strategy of, they're really, really good at going
yeah.
straight to rage, for example, right? So in an organization, when you have these habituated patterns, how aware are you of that pattern? Well, you're not. It's habituated. So when someone points, you need someone at a higher level to point it out. And if that's your boss, that's fantastic, because they'll figure out your strengths and weaknesses. But if it's your colleagues and they say, well, actually, you do this, this is your pattern, sometimes that doesn't come across very well in an organization. But if you
Mm,
can point out, look, this is global details, and these are the resultant behaviors of these kinds of patterns, people latch onto it themselves. Because on Monday, when I was delivering this work to the police apprentices, a couple of them said, oh, you know what, looking at this lot, I think I'm low level. And I said, well, to be honest with you, the fact that you're aware of it is key. You might be low level. There's no good or bad, by the way. The fact that you're aware of it is the first step to development, you know? So when they see the results of these ideas, they will label themselves.
How do we challenge ourselves then? Because I'm thinking of I'm probably giving the game away, I suppose, a bit really here, because I'm thinking now about all the problems. So, for example, if we recruit in an organization, it, if we recruit to a certain pattern of behaviors, do we need to recruit everybody to be the same, or do we recruit
Oh
to
my
have
goodness.
a balance?
This
Because
is only a half-hour talk, Jeremy.
it is. I'm thinking. I'm looking forward to episode 3 already
Well, we
because
can do that.
yeah.
So you're absolutely right. And there's a colleague of mine in the IAD. His name is Timo, up in Norway, and he uses the identity compass to map the roles to the cognitive intentions, the shortcuts, right? And then what you'll do is you then profile 3, 4, 5 people, and the one who matches the role the best using this system is usually the one that's good for the job. And it works, and it does work. Now, we talked about this the other day about hiring clones. When you're in the police recruitment, banking recruitment, are you hiring clones? When my wife used to work for the bank and I go meet her for lunch, for example, you'd see the same people, and it didn't matter what color they were. They all wore blue suits with brown shoes, right? Clone, 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 all coming out. Well, you definitely don't want that in the police. You want people who are capable of thinking and being aware in the moment of how they're going to respond. Do I have to knock this person out? I'm kidding, right? Or do I have to talk nicely to them? You need people who are capable of that in the moment.
Yeah.
So recruitment becomes really, really important and really powerful when you understand who and why you're recruiting to a specific role. I could not be an accountant. I'd miss the numbers that you would pick up easily. Yeah.
Interestingly, there's the other side of being the CFO, though, where you have to be that big picture person, but with a CFO slant. That's another subject. So just returning to those 4 pillars then, you raise those 4 pillars of approaching self-awareness, which are intention, awareness, choice, and response. Could you just add a bit of color to how that works in practice, Darren?
All right. So, Jeremy, your glasses look stupid. I hate them. Right?
Yes. Okay. I'm assuming this is part of the role play. Yeah. Yeah.
So the color you're thinking about is orange because that's what internal is and external is up here. Your response is, Darren, I could not give a monkey's what you think about my glasses, internal locus of evaluation, or, oh my God, he really hates my glasses. I'm going to change them. External locus of evaluation, right? Just 2 of these. When you have too much external, you're starting to look towards therapy. Yeah. If you have too much internal, you're a bit of an arse because it's all about me. What's in it now for me? How much money can I make now for me? Look at Trump, so on and so forth, right? When you've got somebody who is capable of saying, actually, why would Darren say that about my glasses? And what's Darren's expertise on glasses? And why would I listen to Darren's perspective at all? Should I give him any credibility? Now we're starting to balance it out. You know what? He does have a point. You know, my glasses are all right, but I could do with some sexy ones with wire frames that make me look like Elton John, you know, that kind of thing. So, you know what? I've forgotten the bloody question.
So we're rationalizing our response then, aren't we? So intention, awareness, choice, response. What you've just said there is that you've made a statement.
Yeah.
And we're working out how to respond to that.
Yeah, it's my awareness. So what's my intention with internal and external, right? What's my intention? Internal. It's my perspective. How aware am I that I am an internal thinker, right? Can I choose to do external? If I can't choose to do external, my response is pretty much set. If I can choose to do external because I'm aware of my intention, that internal, external are just balanced, then I can choose my response in the moment. I can say, you know what, you could be right, you could be wrong. It doesn't matter.
So do you know what, Darren? If I think about again, and I'll be apolitical on this, but don't we see therefore problems when people in, let's just say, leadership positions across any organization, if they're unable to see anything beyond their own internal position, then that's going to be a problem, isn't it? Because
Yes, sir.
if they are totally convinced that they are right, I mean, I'm probably dumbing this down, but I've read about something called the Dunning-Kruger syndrome, which my understanding of that is that you are so convinced you are right, and you cannot understand why anybody thinks you might be wrong on that. And
So that
if you are right, or that's okay. But if you are seriously making judgments and making calls on the basis that no one can ever convince you that you're wrong, that's dangerous, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, Dunning-Kruger is a good one. It's the Dunning-Kruger effect, and what it says is that stupid people don't know they're stupid,
Mm,
and that's the problem. Do you remember earlier I said that the people in my room said, actually, I'm quite low level. So it's not that they're not aware of how complex they are, but when you look at it from a complexity angle, a person who's on the Dunning-Kruger scale of
mm,
being stupid but not knowing they're stupid, in essence, that's a real lack of complexity.
mm,
You know, and if I can't
yeah,
see, if you say to me, Darren, you're wrong, and I just walk away and say, no, I'm right, that's actually a lack of complexity. You're not capable of an abstract position. You're not capable of putting yourself in other people's shoes, external partner. You're not able to do a global position. So we can deconstruct Dunning-Kruger using these cognitive shortcuts. And it's a great theory, and it was a great, when it came out, everybody latched onto it because it's brilliant. You know, stupid people
what's the
don't know.
opposite? What's the opposite to that then?
Imposter syndrome.
If you're too accepting, so if somebody says that thing over there is black, somebody came and it's clearly black, and somebody comes along and says, well, it's white, and you say, well, yeah, it must be right because
Yeah. So
I haven't got the confidence to tell you that it's actually really black, and everybody else knows it. I'm just going to take your view. Is
it's
that
kind of,
the
yeah,
reverse?
you're people pleasing, and in essence,
Yeah.
the opposite of the low complexity Dunning-Kruger is the imposter syndrome, where you don't think you're good enough, where you know you are good enough, but you don't think you're good enough.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. But people pleasing also again takes you to therapy. This is why I really hate the idea of a servant leader and things like this. You know,
Yeah. Darren, we could genuinely talk about this all day.
I know.
However, I know you've written a book which is called Thinking Deliberately, and presumably you explore this in a lot more detail in that. So, can you tell us a little bit more about the book, when it's out, and how we can get our hands on it?
Yeah, I talk. My colleague Louise is editing it right now. She's got a couple of chapters left. I think one chapter 8. There's 9 chapters. I think she's probably got chapter 8 to go. And I talked to my publisher on Tuesday, and he was, one, very convincing, and two, really good at getting it out there. Amazon, Barnes and Noble, everywhere in the world, literally. So it takes 3 months once they've got the manuscript. It takes 3 months for them to do it. They should get the manuscript by the end of this month. So in theory, it should be available on ebook and paperback. By the way, paperbacks still outstrip everything else. I didn't know that. Paperbacks, May, June, July, probably by the end of summer, towards July, end of July, that kind of thing. Thinking deliberately, and it's called that because we don't.
And that's what you mentioned last time as well. Darren, I am looking forward to our next installment, because for people watching this and thinking leadership can be something that can be learned and that can be taught, what I think we've heard today is an awful lot more to think about to make ourselves effective. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about that next time, about we've delved into some of the challenges and some of the problems, and learn perhaps a bit more about how to solve them next time.
Well, I'll go. Well, I teach leadership at university, and what we look at is that there are the different levels of the awareness quotient: 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Some of those leadership styles are not available. You cannot do transformational leadership if you're AQ6. You can't do it, and we'll talk about that because that's controversial too.
Let's talk about that next time, Darren. It's been a real pleasure. I'm sure that that's going to have generated a lot of interest, and we had a great reaction to our first episode. So, Darren, thank you so much again for joining me today. Real pleasure. Thinking Deliberately, out around about the summer, and maybe we'll have recorded another episode for
Brilliant.
leadership. So, thank you once again. Real pleasure to have you explain that. I don't know whether I'm enthused or daunted in equal measure, perhaps, in that, but something to think about. Thank you so much for your time today, Darren.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Thank you again. Until the next episode of Clarendon Chronicles podcast, thank you to my guest today, Dr. Darren Stevens, author of Thinking Deliberately. Bye for now.